Have you ever entertained angels without knowing it? Have you ever sat down to dinner and looked at the chair across from you, and there was Christ? Years ago, I was the pastor of a suburban congregation. These folks were well off financially, not wealthy, but they were comfortable. One of the most interesting, revealing, and significant ministries that was done by that church, it started before I got there and hopefully continued after I left, so I take no credit for it, was to participate in a feeding program, as it's called. In the nearby city to this suburb, there was a place called Loaves and Fishes, so named after the gospel story. And it was a place where the homeless and the poor could go and receive a meal, especially in the cold winter months, to receive a hot meal and be warm for a time before they were sent out to the streets again to try and find whatever warmth and shelter they could. Our church took its turn in preparing and delivering the meal and then becoming those who would serve it. So once a month, on a Saturday afternoon, a group would gather in the church kitchen in this suburban community, and we would make a meal for 50, drive it into Springfield, and there serve it as well, as part of the hospitality of this program. It was a significant ministry. It was a way of living our faith. It also was something that we offered to the newest members so that they could get to know their fellow members by working in the kitchen, one of the best ways to get to know people in a church. But also so that they could see that we walked the walk of our Christian faith. And it was a wonderful way to fold in the newest members with those who had been doing this for years. Well, one Saturday evening, when we were there serving the guests, as we were encouraged to call them, these folks who had a hard scrabble life, these folks who came in pretty beaten up by life, and sometimes by their own choices, yes, I admit that. We were there, and quite frankly, as always happened, quite humbled by how well off we had it, by the comfortable, warm homes that we would be returning to. And we saw these men and women, and sometimes children, with compassion. And we were glad that we were part of the charity that helped them get through another day. But then something happened on that Saturday that I'd like to share with you. There we were, feeding the homeless, when in the middle of the meal, almost towards the end of it, almost when it was too late to arrive and be accepted by the rules of this program, a man came to the door, dressed shabbily, but he was really trying for a homeless man to dress up as best he could. He looked around, and he raised his hand, and he said, "Table for one?" By his humor, we had to see him as human, not simply as homeless. He became an individual, not part of a category. And the distance between his humanity and our humanity suddenly shrunk down to the normal size it should be. Just another brother in the family of Christ. In the 6th century, there was a man named Benedict, known to us today as Saint Benedict. His enduring contribution to the long history of the church is that Benedict formed men and then women into monastic communities. He wrote the Rule of Benedict, which is still used by most monasteries, most people who live in that kind of Christian community. And it's endured for 1,500 years. We're going way back here in Christian history. It's significant that at the time that Benedict was forming these communities, that the Roman Empire was ending, that civility and even civilization itself was beginning to crumble. And there were threats from the outside of barbarians, as they were called, and truly sometimes compared to the peace and the organization of Roman life, it truly was chaotic and barbarian. And yet when the Roman Empire collapsed, civilization here and there continued in these monastic communities throughout Europe and England and Ireland. They kept the small flame of civilization going. In this small work of Benedict's, barely 100 pages, 73 very brief to the point chapters, are all that men and women need to know to live in monastic community. It's a rule that's still being practiced today, for there are monasteries all over. I've had the good fortune of going to two of them and spending some time, one an Orthodox and one an Episcopal monastery, to spend a few days. And why was I allowed to go? It is because in the rule of Benedict, monasteries are required to offer hospitality to strangers, to travelers, and to seekers. They are required by their Christian faith to interrupt their life of prayer and work, to welcome those who come and knock on the door. And they are to bring them in not begrudgingly, not to just offer the duty of charity, but instead they are to welcome the stranger, the seeker, and the traveler, and provide them with food and drink and a place to rest, and also to offer them their hearts and their goodwill. Hospitality is not something tacked on to monastic life. It is, like prayer and work, at the heart of their Christian life, the heart of their way of walking in the way of Christ. I've used two words this morning, charity and hospitality. What is the difference between charity and hospitality? Well, I like to tell stories, so let me answer the question with a story, a true story. In the late 1990s, the Church of the Epiphany, an Episcopal church in downtown Washington, D.C., was in decline and even dying. The neighborhood had changed, as has so often happened in the latter part of the 20th century, and so it no longer had people living around the church as they had before. And the people who were attending church were coming in from quite a distance and aging, and the church was huge, built for a different time and more people, and now seems sad and dying. But something happened, and that Church of the Epiphany now is a revitalized Christian community, filled with people and filled with activity. And as I understand the story, as it was told to me, and you can read about it in a book that I can recommend, one of the main reasons that this church experienced revitalization was their ministry to the homeless population that did live around their church and congregated often during the day in the little park, the city park, that was right outside the church's doors. Well, it began small. After church, on Sunday, there would be a small group that would gather in the church kitchen, and they would make sandwiches, and they would go out to the front steps of the church, and there they would offer these sandwiches to the homeless men and women, mostly men, that were there. But then the winter chill set in, and those who were out on the front steps were getting cold. And so someone came up with a good idea. Well, instead of offering sandwiches, let's offer a hot breakfast in our church basement. And that way we can be warm too. So the church moved from after church to before church in the church basement, where a hot breakfast was prepared. And the homeless men were eager to come in out of a cold night, and there they would be offered to serve themselves. Then the next step happened, and that was, instead of having the homeless on the other side of the table, serving themselves, and the good people of Epiphany on the other side offering what they had to give in charity, they decided to do as loaves and fishes had done, to treat these men as guests. And church members not only prepared the breakfast, but they served it. Now here's what really happened that changed things. The next and logical step was for the congregation to invite their guests after breakfast to come upstairs and join them in the worship service. It was done kind of as a lark, as an experiment, but from the first Sunday on, there were those who came up and joined in worship. Oh, and yes, some were there because in the wintertime it was another hour to remain warm. But listen to what happened next, and this is from the people of that church. There was one man who said that he was taking the collection, and he almost was moved to tears when he had a decision to make, because there was a homeless person in the back of the church, and did he take the plate to a homeless man? But he thought, well, we offered hospitality, not charity. I'd better welcome him as I would anyone who looked well-heeled. So he went back, and the man pulled out $1, perhaps his last, and put it in the plate. And as the man said, it brought him to tears. Well, from that point, when those downstairs would come for breakfast and then come to worship, came all kinds of relationships. Some had started down at the breakfast, but they expanded upstairs. And suddenly the people in the church knew these men by name. And they were no longer homeless man A or homeless woman B. They were Joe, our Joe. Or they were Jane, the Jane that comes and joins us in worship. And here's what happened next that helped revitalize the Church of the Epiphany. They took the next step and boldly invited their guests, Jane, Joe, those they knew by name, to become church members. And they did. And now, even though they are still homeless, they sit on the church's committees. That is the difference between charity and hospitality. When we see them not as a category, but as human. When we see them as not a problem, but a brother or sister that we welcome home. In the Gospel of Matthew, in the 25th chapter, we read about what we might call Judgment Day, at the end of days, when, according to these verses, we will be judged. And Jesus says the difference between the saved and the damned will simply be this. Did you feed the hungry? Did you give drink to the thirsty? Did you clothe the poor? Did you go to those in prisons when you could? Did you do these things when you could? Before you died and it was too late, did you do these things when you could? And Jesus goes on to say, because if you did it to one of them, it was like doing it to me. In the Rule of St. Benedict, we read that Benedict said, "Let everyone be received as if he would."